Do you hear it? The echoes of the past, the whispers of forgotten truths, fragments of memories lost in the shadows. Welcome to Brainrot, Echoes, where we bring you stories long buried, unravel mysteries cloaked by time, and guide you through the darkest corners of the mind and the universe. Each video is more than just content. It's an echo resonating deep within, urging you to question, to wonder, to explore. Backend index pointing right, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us in listening to the echoes the world tried to silence. A scholarly encounter with human warfare, a perspective from Earth. Setting: a high-tech classroom on a distant planet, where various alien species study the history and characteristics of different species across the universe. Professor Zixth adjusted her optical sensors as the holographic display flickered to life in the center of the advanced xenobiology classroom. 23 students from various species sat in the tiered seating, their attention fixed on what was about to be the most horrifying documentary they'd seen all semester. Now, I must warn you, the professor continued, her tentacles writhing slightly with what could only be described as academic excitement. What you're about to witness is quite disturbing. These creatures, species 7749C, also known as humans, have somehow managed to survive on a death world through sheer violence. And, oh, come on, a voice chimed from row 3. Every head, antenna, eye stalk, and sensory organ in the room turned to stare at the human exchange student who had just spoken. Leia Brennan sat there with her arms crossed, looking like she was about to argue with her own reflection. Professor Zix's voice took on that special tone that educators across the galaxy had perfected, though I'm pretending I didn't hear that interruption tone. As I was saying, these Death World creatures have developed warfare to such an extreme that— Death World? Leia snorted. Lady, have you ever actually been to Earth? Or are you just reading from your little xenobiology textbook there? The silence that followed was the kind you usually only hear right before someone gets spectacularly murdered, or right after someone realizes they've accidentally insulted a deity. It was heavy, awkward, and filled with the collective sound of 22 alien students trying to figure out if they were about to witness an academic discussion or a homicide. Professor Thar's tentacles stopped writhing. This was either a very good sign or a very bad sign, depending on your perspective and your familiarity with Superior body language. Miss Brennan, is it? The professor's voice had dropped to that dangerous register that suggested she was either about to deliver a devastating lecture or call security. Perhaps you'd like to share your insights with the class? Leia smirked. Sure, but first, why don't you show us this footage? I'm curious to see what passes for barbaric human warfare in your curriculum. If you've never seen a room full of alien students trying to simultaneously lean forward in anticipation and lean back in terror, you're missing out on one of the universe's most awkward spectacles. It's like watching a nature documentary where all the gazelles are trying to get a better look at the lion while also preparing to run for their lives. The holographic display brightened, and suddenly the classroom was filled with the sounds of explosions, gunfire, and what could only be described as humans being humans in the worst possible way. The footage showed a war zone that looked like someone had taken the concept of a bad day and decided to make it into a competitive sport. Buildings were reduced to rubble. Vehicles that had probably been expensive were now serving as very expensive paperweights. Smoke filled the air thick enough to choke on. And through it all, you could see figures moving with the kind of determination that suggested they had somewhere very important to be and weren't going to let a little thing like mortal danger slow them down. As you can see, Professor Zix began, her academic enthusiasm returning. The humans show a complete disregard for their own safety, charging in a battle with primitive projectile weapons. Primitive? Leia interrupted again. Those are M4 carbines with ACOG scopes. That's a javelin missile system in the background. And that, she pointed at a particularly impressive explosion on the display, is definitely not primitive. That's a JDM from an F-18, probably a Mark 82 with a guidance kit. The classroom had gone so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Assuming pins make noise when they drop in the vacuum of space, which they don't, but you get the idea. How old are you? Professor Thar began, then stopped. Her optical sensors focused on Leia with the intensity of someone who had just realized they might have made a terrible mistake. Leia was studying the footage with the casual interest of someone watching a mildly entertaining movie. Oh, this is interesting. See that building complex in the background? The one that's not completely demolished yet. That's the Kandahar Provincial Reconstruction Team compound. Well, what's left of it? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has weight and substance. The kind that presses down on you like a heavy blanket made of awkwardness and slowly dawning horror. You recognize this footage? Professor Zix said slowly. Well, yeah. Leia moved around the room, suddenly aware that 22 pairs of alien eyes, or eye equivalents, were staring at her with expressions that range from fascination to terror. I was there. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like when an entire classroom of alien students simultaneously experiences an existential crisis, it's remarkably similar to the sound of a small wind chime being strangled. You were there, repeated Keth Moore, a Taurian student whose usual blue complexion had shifted to what could only be described as, oh, beige. Yeah, not for the whole thing. I was only there for about 8 months. Combat engineer with the 569th. Leia paused, looking at the footage again. Actually, I think I can see my handiwork in that crater on the left. We had to clear that intersection after the insurgents kept using it for IED placement. Took us 3 days to combat engineer. The exclamation came from at least 6 different students simultaneously, creating a harmony of terror that would have been quite beautiful if it hadn't been so pants-sweatingly scary. Yeah, explosives and fortifications mostly, some route clearance. Pretty standard stuff. Leia was still watching the footage with professional interest. Although I have to say whoever edited this together did a pretty good job. They got the timeline right, and the audio sync is spot on. Usually these documentary things are all over the place with the Miss Brennan. Professor Zix Thor interrupted, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was rapidly reassessing everything she thought she knew about human students. Are you telling this class that you have personally participated in combat operations? Well, duh. That's why I'm here, right? Cultural exchange program. Although, I have to say, your definition of barbaric warfare is quite tame. This is just a Tuesday in Afghanistan. The collective intake of breath from the class sounded like a small hurricane trying to squeeze through a keyhole. A Tuesday, repeated Vashti, a crystalline whose usual soft chiming had taken on distinctly discordant tones. You're saying this level of destruction and violence is routine. Yeah, this is actually pretty calm compared to some of the stuff I've seen. You should see footage from Fallujah in '04 or some of the Syria operations. Now, that was what I call barbaric. Leia paused, considering. Though, I guess it depends on your definition of barbaric. We usually tried to keep collateral damage to a minimum. Professor Zix was making notes with the frantic energy of someone who had just realized their entire curriculum might need to be rewritten. Collateral damage minimization in a combat zone that you consider routine? Well, yeah. We're not animals. Leia looked truly offended. There are rules. Geneva Convention, rules of engagement, all that stuff. You can't just go around blowing things up willy-nilly. There's paperwork. Paperwork? Echoed Mord, whose usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the expression of someone who had just discovered that their worst nightmares had administrative overhead. Oh, tons of paperwork. After-action reports, incident reports, ammunition expenditure forms. You blow up one building without proper authorization, and you'll be filling out forms for weeks. Leia shook her head at the memory. Although I have to admit the bureaucracy was sometimes more painful than the actual fight. The footage continued playing, showing more scenes of urban warfare, and Leia kept up a running commentary that was somehow both informative and terrifying. See that maneuver there? Classic room clearing technique. Notice how they're not just charging in. Proper corner clearing, checking their angles, maintaining fire discipline. These guys know what they're doing. Fire discipline? Professor Zix repeated faintly. Yeah, not wasting ammunition, making sure you have clear fields of fire, not shooting at anything that isn't a legitimate target. Basic stuff. Leia pointed at the screen again. Although, I have to say that squad formation is a little loose for urban terrain. I would have tightened up the interval between. You're critiquing their tactical performance? Interrupted Jexra, a hive mind representative whose individual voices had started speaking in different octaves from stress. Well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to show combat footage in class, you might as well learn something from it, right? These guys are pretty good, but they're making a few mistakes that could get them killed in a reel. Leia stopped, looking around the room. Wait, you all know this is real footage, right? Like this actually happened. The silence that followed was so complete, it had its own gravitational field. Of course it's real, Professor Thar said slowly. We're studying actual human warfare patterns to understand how your species managed to survive on such a hostile world. Hostile world? Leia blinked. Earth isn't hostile. It's actually pretty nice most of the time. Great weather, decent food, gravity's not too heavy. Atmosphere is breathable for most species once you adjust for the oxygen content. I mean, sure, we have some natural disasters and predators, but nothing too crazy. Miss Brennan, Professor Zix said with the patience of someone explaining quantum physics to a particularly slow houseplant. Your planet has weather systems that can destroy cities, geological activity that can reshape continents, and carnivorous megafauna that hunt in coordinated packs. Okay, first of all, wolves aren't that big. And second, most of our weather is actually quite predictable once you understand patterns. We've got pretty good early warning systems for the bad stuff. Leia paused, and the geological activity keeps things interesting. Plus, it's great for creating natural resources and fertile soil. The class was staring at her with the fascination typically reserved for observing creatures that shouldn't exist, but clearly do. You consider tectonic activity beneficial? Nixa, whose feathers had ruffled so much she looked like an explosion in a pillow factory. Well, yeah, volcanism creates some of the most fertile soil on the planet. Earthquakes are scary, but they're part of how the planet regulates itself. And the mountain ranges they create are gorgeous. You should see the Himalayas sometime. Absolutely beautiful. She's scaling catastrophic geological events as scenic, whispered Yithgara to her neighbor, apparently not realizing that humans have pretty good hearing. I can't hear you, Leia said conversationally. And they're not catastrophic unless you're unprepared. We've got building codes, early warning systems, evacuation procedures. It's all about preparation and adaptation. Prepare. Professor Zixth repeated, making more notes for planetary-scale destructive events. Well, yeah. I mean, what else are you going to do? Complain about it? The planet's going to do what the planet's going to do. You either adapt or you become a fossil. Leia snapped. Although I guess that's true for most things, not just geography. The footage had moved on to show some of the aftermath of the battle. Medics treating wounded soldiers, engineers clearing debris, logistics teams bringing in supplies. Leia watched with professional interest. Now, this is the part they usually don't show in these documentary things. She said, the cleanup. See those guys with the metal detectors? EOD, explosive ordnance disposal. They're making sure there aren't any unexploded rounds or IEDs left behind. Dangerous work, but somebody's got to do it. They're cleaning up? Asked Vorthak, whose usual stoic demeanor had been replaced by visible confusion. Well, yeah, you can't just leave a war zone sitting there. People need to be able to live and work in these areas after the fighting's over. Infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, medical care provided, basic services restored. Leia gestured at the screen. See those engineers with the heavy equipment? They're probably assessing what can be salvaged and what needs to be rebuilt from scratch. You rebuild, Professor Zix said slowly. After destruction? Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the point, isn't it? The destruction is supposed to be temporary. You're trying to create conditions where people can live safely and peacefully. Leia looked around the room again. What did you think we were doing? Just blowing things up for fun? The expressions on the various alien faces suggested that yes, that was exactly what they had thought. Miss Brennan, Professor Zix said carefully. Perhaps you could explain to the class what you believe the purpose of warfare to be. Warfare. It's problem-solving through applied violence. But the violence is just one tool in the toolkit. Leia settled back in her chair, warming to the subject. The goal is to create conditions where the problem can be solved permanently without more violence, usually. At least that's the theory. Problem solving, repeated Keith Moore, whose color had shifted again to what could only be described as existential crisis purple. Yeah, like you've got a group of people who are making life miserable for a larger group of people and diplomatic solutions haven't worked, so you apply military force to change the equation. But the military force is supposed to create conditions where you can implement a political solution. Leia paused. Although I'll admit it doesn't always work out that way. Politics is complicated. You're describing warfare as a temporary measure to enable diplomacy, said Jexra. There are multiple voices now speaking in unison in a way that suggested deep disturbance. Well, yeah. What else would it be? You can't maintain a military occupation forever. It's too expensive, and it doesn't solve the underlying problems. Eventually, you need to either fix the problems that caused the conflict in the first place or accept that you're going to be fighting forever. Leia snapped, and nobody wants to fight forever. It's exhausting. The footage had shifted to show some of the reconstruction efforts. New schools being built, medical clinics being established, local people working alongside international personnel. Leia watched with what looked like satisfaction. See, this is the important part. You can blow things up all day long, but if you don't build something better in place, you haven't actually accomplished anything. You've just created more problems. She pointed at the screen. That school there, that's probably going to do more to prevent future conflicts than all the military operations combined. Education as conflict prevention. Professor Thar murmured, scribbling notes frantically. Well, yeah. It's hard to radicalize people who have access to information and economic opportunities. Although, I'll admit it's a long-term strategy. Building schools and hospitals doesn't make for very exciting news coverage. Leia grinned. Nobody ever made a blockbuster movie about a successful infrastructure development project. But you participated in both, observed Vashi. The destruction and the reconstruction. That's what combat engineers do. We blow things up when they need to be blown up, and we build things when they need to be built. Sometimes on the same day, Leia's expression grew thoughtful. Actually, that was one of the things I liked about the job. You got to see the whole process, not just part of it. You enjoyed it? The question came from Mordith, whose voice had climbed several octaves. Parts of it. I wouldn't want to do it forever. But there was something satisfying about solving problems, especially when you can see the positive results. Leia paused. Although I'll admit, the getting shot at part was less fun. But that's what the training is for. Training, Professor Zix said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was afraid to ask, but had to know. Oh, tons of training. Physical conditioning, weapons training, tactical procedures, engineering techniques, first aid, communications, survival skills, and that's just the basic stuff. Leia stretched, looking comfortable in a way that somehow made everyone else deeply uncomfortable. Then you've got specialized training depending on your job. For engineers, that meant explosives handling, construction techniques, route clearance procedures, improvised explosive device disposal, plus ongoing training to keep up with new techniques and equipment. How long? Asked Nix Allah in a voice that sounded like she was afraid of the answer. Does this training take? Well, basic training was about 4 months. Then advanced individual training was another 6 months. Then on-the-job training for about a year before you're really competent, Leia considered. But you never really stop training. Technology changes, tactics evolve, new threats emerge. If you're not constantly learning and adapting, you become obsolete quite quickly. Nearly 2 years of training, whispered Yithgara, for a single individual. And that's just for one specialty. Officers have to learn completely different skills, and special forces training takes even longer. Leia nodded toward the screen. Those guys in the footage, they probably represent decades of collective training and experience. You don't just hand someone a rifle and tell them to go fight. Well, you can, but it doesn't usually end well. The classroom had taken on the atmosphere of a support group for people who had just discovered that everything they thought they knew about the universe was wrong. Miss Brennan, Professor Zix said slowly, how common is military service among humans? Depends on the country and the time period. In the US, it's all volunteer now, so maybe 1% of the population serves at any given time, but in some countries, everyone does a couple years of mandatory service. Leia snapped. And of course, during major conflicts, those numbers go way up. World War II, for instance, we had something like 12% of the entire population in uniform. 12%, repeated Keith more faintly. Yeah, and that was just the people in uniform. You had probably another 20% working in defense industries, and pretty much everyone else was contributing to the war effort in some way. Rationing, victory gardens, buying war bonds, working in factories. Leia smiled at the memory. My grandmother used to tell stories about working at a munitions plant during the war. Said it was some of the hardest work she'd ever done, but also some of the most meaningful. Your entire civilization mobilized for warfare, said Jexra, all their voices speaking in hushed tones. Well, yeah. I mean, when someone's trying to conquer the world and commit genocide, you don't really have a choice. You either fight back or you end up as a footnote in someone else's history book. Leia's expression grew serious. Although, I'll admit that was an extreme case. Most conflicts don't require that level of mobilization. Most conflicts, Professor Zixth repeated, making yet more notes. Yeah, we've gotten better at managing international disputes without full-scale warfare. International law, economic sanctions, peacekeeping forces, diplomatic pressure. War is usually a last resort now, at least among the major powers. Leia paused. Though regional conflicts still happen, and there's always the terrorism problem. Terrorism, said Vorthack, and somehow managed to make the word sound even more ominous than usual. Yeah, non-state actors using violence to achieve political goals. It's actually a pretty old problem, but it's gotten more sophisticated with modern technology and communications. Leia gestured at the screen where the footage was showing some of the security measures around the compound. That's part of what we were dealing with in Afghanistan. Not a conventional army, just groups of people with grievances and access to weapons. And you consider this manageable? Asked Vashi. Well, you manage it the same way you manage any other problem. You identify the root causes. You address what you can address. You contain what you can't address. And you adapt as the situation changes. Leia snapped. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it's doable. The key is not to expect simple solutions to complex problems. The footage had ended, leaving the classroom in relative silence, except for the soft hum of the holographic projector cooling down. Professor Zixth stared at her notes, which had expanded from a simple lesson plan to what looked like the beginning of a doctoral thesis. Miss Brennan, she said finally, I think we may need to revise our curriculum. Probably a good idea, Leia agreed. Though you might want to add some context about why humans fight, not just how they fight. The how is just technique. The why is what makes it make sense. And why do humans fight? Asked Mordeth, though he sounded like he was afraid of the answer. Same reason anyone fights, I guess. To protect something we care about, or to stop someone from hurting people we're responsible for, or because we don't see any other way to solve a problem. Leia's expression grew thoughtful. Although I'll admit, sometimes we fight because we're stubborn and stupid too. We're not perfect, but you're effective, observed Nick Sola. At fighting, yeah, we're pretty good at it. But we're also pretty good at not fighting when that's an option. Most humans go their whole lives without ever being in a real fight. Leia smiled. We've gotten good at creating systems that let people resolve conflicts without violence. Legal systems, democratic processes, economic mechanisms, social institutions. Fighting is what we do when those systems break down. Systems, Professor Zixth murmured, adding more notes. Yeah, lots of systems. Human society is basically a bunch of overlapping systems designed to let people cooperate instead of compete. Most of the time, they work quite well. Leia paused. Although I'll admit they're not foolproof. People are still people, and sometimes people make bad choices. But when the systems fail, said Yithgara, you're prepared for that. Well, yeah. Hope for the best. Prepare for the worst. That's just good planning. Leia looked around the room. I mean, don't you have contingency plans for when things go wrong? The expressions on the various alien faces suggested that no, They did not have contingency plans that involved personally participating in armed combat. Most civilized species, Professor Zixt said carefully, rely on external authorities to handle conflicts that cannot be resolved through normal channels. External authorities? Leia repeated. Like who? The Galactic Mediation Council, the Interspecies Arbitration Board, the Cosmic Peacekeeping Force. Professor Zixt gestured vaguely. Civilized beings don't typically resort to personal violence. Leia considered this. What happens when the external authorities can't or won't help? The silence that followed suggested that this was not a question most species had seriously considered. Leia continued, what if the Galactic Mediation Council is compromised, or the Cosmic Peacekeeping Force is busy somewhere else, or the problem is happening too fast for external intervention? She looked around the room. What's your backup plan? We assume that such situations are unlikely, said Kethmore uncertainly. Unlikely, Leia repeated, but not impossible. Well, no, admitted Vosai. Not impossible. So, what do you do if the impossible happens and you can't rely on external help? Leia's tone was truly curious, not accusatory. The classroom had gone quiet again, but this time it was the quiet of people thinking rather than the quiet of people being discouraged. We submit, said Jexra finally, or negotiate or relocate. And if submission isn't acceptable, negotiation isn't possible, and relocation isn't feasible. Another long silence. We would likely perish, Professor Thar said slowly. Leia digested this. That seems like a significant vulnerability in your social structure. It has never been a problem before, Morith said, though he sounded less certain than usual. Yeah, but it's never been a problem before isn't really a sustainable long-term strategy for dealing with existential threats. Leia smirked. Maybe it worked for you, but it seems like putting all your eggs in one basket. You're suggesting that our reliance on external authority structures is naive. Professor Zixt asked. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just pointing out that any system that depends on external factors you can't control has some inherent risks. Leia paused. Although I guess that's true for human systems too. The difference is that we try to maintain the capability to handle problems internally if the external systems fail. By maintaining the capacity for violence, said Vorak. By maintaining the capacity to solve problems using all available tools, including violence when necessary, Leia corrected. Violence is just one tool, but it's a pretty important tool when you need it. But doesn't the availability of violence make it more likely to be used? Asked Nixella. That's the theory. Yeah, and it's probably true to some extent, but the alternative is being completely helpless when someone else decides to use violence against you, Leia considered. I guess it's a trade-off. You accept some risk of misuse in exchange for the capability to defend yourself when necessary. A calculated risk, Professor Zixt mused. Everything's a calculated risk. The question is whether you're doing the calculating consciously or just hoping for the best. Leia smiled. Although I'll admit, humans aren't always great at calculating risks accurately. We tend to overestimate some threats and underestimate others. But you prepare for them anyway, observed Yithgara. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, Leia agreed. Although I guess that philosophy doesn't work for everyone. The classroom had settled into what could almost be described as a thoughtful atmosphere, which was quite different from the previous atmosphere of barely contained panic. Miss Brennan, Professor Zixt said finally, would you be willing to share more of your experiences with the class? I think we could all benefit from a more comprehensive understanding of human approaches to conflict resolution. Sure, but you might want to adjust your curriculum objectives. If you're trying to understand humans, you can't just focus on the violence. Leia grinned. That's like trying to understand music by only studying the percussion section. Although, I admit the percussion section is quite important. What would you suggest we focus on? Asked Keithmore. Well, if you really want to understand human warfare, you need to understand human cooperation first, because warfare is basically cooperation turned inside out. Leia leaned forward, warming to the subject. Think about it. Military units are some of the most cooperative human organizations ever created. Everyone has a specific role. Everyone depends on everyone else. And everyone works toward common objectives. Cooperation, repeated Vashi. In warfare, oh, absolutely. Modern warfare is incredibly complex. You've got logistics, communications, intelligence, medical support, engineering, transportation, maintenance, administration. It takes thousands of people working together to support a single combat unit. Leia gestured enthusiastically. And that's just the military side. You've got civilian contractors, allied forces, local partners, international organizations. It's basically a massive cooperative effort to achieve destruction. To achieve destruction, pointing out more deaths. To achieve objectives, Leia corrected. Destruction is just one possible means to an end. Although I'll admit, it's often the most visible means. But surely the competition aspect, began Jexra. Competition and cooperation aren't mutually exclusive, Leia interrupted. Teams compete against other teams, but within the team, it's all cooperation. And even between competing teams, there are usually rules and standards that everyone agrees to follow. Rules? Professor Zix said, scribbling frantically. In warfare, oh, tons of rules. Geneva Conventions, laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, international humanitarian law. There are rules about what you can and can't target, how you have to treat prisoners, what weapons you can and can't use, how you have to protect civilians. Leia paused. Although I'll admit, not everyone follows the rules, and enforcement can be problematic. You have laws governing warfare, said Yeager slowly. Well, yeah, just because you're fighting doesn't mean you abandon all moral and ethical principles. War is destructive enough without making it worse than it has to be. Leia's expression grew serious. Plus, you have to think about what comes after the war. If you commit atrocities during the conflict, it makes it much harder to build a sustainable peace afterward. Sustainable peace, Professor Zixth repeats. Yeah, that's the whole point, isn't it? To create conditions where people can live together without fighting. If you do terrible things during the war, you're just creating grievances that will lead to future conflicts. Leia snapped. Although again, not everyone thinks that far ahead. The classroom had grown quiet again, but this time it was the quiet of people processing new information rather than the quiet of people experiencing existential terror. Miss Brennan, Professor Zix said finally, I think we're going to need to completely restructure this course. Probably a good idea, Leia agreed. Although you might want to bring in some other perspectives, too. I'm just one person with one set of experiences. Human approaches to conflict vary quite a bit depending on culture, history, resources, and circumstances. Other perspectives? The professor mused. Yes, that would be valuable. Perhaps we could arrange for additional guest speakers. Just maybe give them some advanced warning about what you're planning to discuss, Leia suggested. Some of my classmates from the Veterans Program might be willing to talk to your students, but they'd appreciate knowing what they're getting into. Veterans Program? Asked Vorthak. Educational benefits for former military personnel. The idea is to help people transition from military to civilian careers by providing access to higher education. Leia smiled. That's actually how I ended up here. The cultural exchange program was part of my degree requirements, and this seemed like an interesting way to fulfill them. You're here as part of your education, said Nixola. Not as a career diplomat or cultural representative. Nope, just a student trying to finish my degree in international relations with a focus on comparative political systems. Leia grinned. Although I have to say this has been more educational than I expected. What did you expect? Asked Kethmore. Honestly, I figured I'd spend a semester learning about alien cultures, writing some papers about comparative governance structures, and maybe picking up enough xenobiology credits to satisfy my science requirements. Leia looked around the room. I didn't expect to end up giving impromptu lectures on human military theory. And yet you seem quite comfortable doing so, observed Professor Zixth. Well, it's not exactly rocket science. I mean, it is science, but it's more social science than anything else. Human behavior, group dynamics, organizational theory, resource allocation, strategy, planning, Leia skipped. Plus, I spent 4 years thinking about this stuff professionally, so it's not like it's completely foreign to me. For years, repeated JRA. That's a significant portion of a human lifespan. Not really. Humans live 70 to 80 years on average, longer with good medical care. 4 years is maybe 5% of a lifetime, although I'll admit it's a pretty formative 5%. Leia's expression grew thoughtful. Military service changes you. Not necessarily in bad ways, but it definitely changes your perspective on things. How so? Asked Vashti. Well, you learn to function under stress. You learn to work as part of a team. You learn to take responsibility for other people's safety and well-being. You also learn to deal with uncertainty, to make decisions with incomplete information, and to adapt when things don't go according to plan. Leia paused. Plus, you get a pretty realistic view of what people are capable of, both good and bad. And you consider this valuable? Asked Morith. Absolutely. I mean, the specific skills aren't always transferable to civilian life, but the underlying capabilities are useful in almost any field. Problem solving, leadership, teamwork, stress management, attention to detail. Leia smiled. Plus, you learn not to panic when things go wrong, which is surprisingly useful in civilian life. Things go wrong in civilian life? Asked Yithgara, sounding truly puzzled. Well, yeah. Equipment breaks down, people make mistakes, unexpected problems arise, emergencies happen. Civilian life isn't as predictable as people like to think. Leia looked around the room. Don't you have emergencies in your societies? We have systems for handling unexpected events, said Professor Zix carefully. Right. But what happens when the systems fail, or when the unexpected event is bigger than the systems can handle? Leia's tone was truly curious. I mean, systems are great, but they're designed by imperfect beings to handle predictable problems. What about the unpredictable ones? The silence that followed was becoming a familiar feature of this classroom discussion. We contact the appropriate authorities, said Kethmore eventually. And if the appropriate authorities are part of the problem, or if they're overwhelmed, or if communication systems are down, Leia pressed gently. That would be unprecedented, admitted Vashi. Yeah, but unprecedented things happen all the time. That's what makes them unprecedented. Leia leaned back in her chair. Natural disasters, equipment failures, social unrest, economic collapse, pandemic diseases, asteroid impacts, solar flares. The universe is full of low-probability, high-impact events. You prepare for asteroid impacts? Asked Nala, her feathers rustling with what could only be described as incredulous alarm. Well, we're starting to. NASA has a planetary defense program now. We're tracking near-Earth objects and developing techniques for deflecting them if necessary. Leia grinned. Although I'll admit, it's more of a long-term project. We're not exactly ready to handle a dinosaur killer asteroid just yet. Dinosaur killer, repeated Morith faintly. Yeah, the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. About 10 kilometers across, hit the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of several billion nuclear weapons. Leia spoke with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Caused global climate change, mass extinctions, the works. Really bad day for the dinosaurs. The classroom had achieved a new level of silence, one that suggested the occupants were rapidly running out of ways to be surprised by human casual attitudes toward catastrophic events. And you study this? Why? Asked Professor Zix weakly. Well, it happened before, so it could happen again. Better to be prepared than surprised. Leia snapped. Plus, understanding past extinction events helps us understand how to prevent future ones. Paleontology, geology, astronomy, climate science, it all fits together. You study extinction events, said Yegara, to prevent them, among other things. Yeah, though I'll admit we're probably more likely to cause our own extinction than preventing it. Leia's expression grew more serious. Climate change, nuclear weapons, biological warfare, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology. We've got lots of ways to accidentally wipe ourselves out. Accidentally, repeated Jexra. Well, probably accidentally. I mean, nobody really wants to end human civilization. But complex systems can fail in unexpected ways, and the more powerful your technology gets, the more catastrophic the potential failures become. Leia paused. That's actually one of the reasons military training emphasizes things like redundancy, fail-safes, and damage control. When you're dealing with potentially destructive systems, you need to think about what happens when things go wrong. But surely, said Vorak, the rational response to such risks would be to avoid developing dangerous technologies in the first place. Leia laughed, but it wasn't an entirely happy sound. Yeah, that would be the rational response. Unfortunately, humans aren't always rational, and even when we are, we don't always agree on what constitutes rational behavior. You develop dangerous technologies despite knowing they're dangerous? Professor Zixth asked, her note-taking having evolved into what looked like frantic scribbling. Well, it's not that simple. Most technologies aren't inherently dangerous. They become dangerous depending on how they're used. Leia gestured vaguely. Nuclear technology can power cities or destroy them. Biological research can cure diseases or create weapons. Artificial intelligence can solve complex problems or replace human decision-making in ways that might not be beneficial. So, you regulate these technologies, suggested Keithmore. We try to, but regulation is complicated, especially when you're dealing with international competition and rapid technological development. Leia's expression grew thoughtful. Plus, the same research that leads to dangerous applications often leads to beneficial ones, too. You can't always separate the good applications from the bad ones. So, you accept the risks, said Vashi. We try to manage the risks while capturing the benefits, though I'll admit we're not always successful. Leia smiled wryly. Human history is full of examples of technologies that seemed like good ideas at the time, but turn out to have unexpected consequences. Such as, asked Nala. Well, lead paint seemed like a great idea until we figured out it was poisoning children. Asbestos was a miracle fire-resistant material until we discovered it caused cancer. CFCs were revolutionary refrigerants until we realized they were destroying the ozone layer. Leia snapped. And those are just the obvious ones. Every generation discovers that some of the things the previous generation thought were safe turn out to be problematic. But you continue developing new technologies, observing Morith. Well, yeah. The alternative is technological stagnation, which has its own risks. Diseases we can't cure, problems we can't solve, disasters we can't prevent. Leia paused. Plus, humans are naturally curious. We like figuring out how things work and finding new ways to do things. It's hard to suppress that impulse without suppressing a lot of other positive qualities, too. Curiosity, Professor Thar murmured, adding yet more notes. Yeah, curiosity is probably one of our most distinctive traits. We want to know how things work, why they work, what would happen if we changed them, what would happen if we combined them with other things. Leia grinned. Sometimes that leads to amazing discoveries, and sometimes it leads to spectacular disasters, often both simultaneously. You consider this desirable? Asked Yithkara. The curiosity? Absolutely. The disasters, not so much, but they're kind of inevitable given the level of curiosity, Leia considered. I mean, you can't learn about the universe without occasionally learning things you wish you hadn't learned. And you can't develop new capabilities without occasionally developing capabilities you wish you hadn't developed. So you accept both the positive and negative consequences, said Jaxra. We try to maximize the positive and minimize the negative. But yeah, we accept that you can't completely eliminate the risks without also eliminating the benefits. Leia's tone grew more serious, though I'll admit some of the potential risks are getting pretty scary. We might be approaching the point where the consequences of failure are too catastrophic to accept, such as, Professor Zixth asked, though she sounded like she was afraid of the answer. Well, artificial general intelligence could potentially make human intelligence obsolete, which raises some interesting questions about what happens to humans afterward. Nanotechnology could enable self-replicating machines that might not stop replicating when we want them to. Genetic engineering can create organisms that we can't control. Leia paused. And of course, there's always the possibility of nuclear war, which could set civilization back centuries, even if it doesn't cause extinction. The classroom had achieved what could only be described as stunned silence. You're aware of these risks, said Vorik slowly, and you continue pursuing these technologies anyway. Well, We're not pursuing them recklessly. There's a lot of research into AI safety, nanotechnology containment, biosafety protocols, nuclear arms control. Leia snapped. But the research that leads to dangerous capabilities often leads to beneficial capabilities, too. And it's hard to regulate research that hasn't happened yet. Plus, she continued, there's always the possibility that someone else will develop these technologies first, and they might not be as concerned about safety as you are. So, there's a strategic element to it, too. Strategic element? Repeated Keith Moore. Yeah. If you don't develop defensive capabilities against new technologies, you're vulnerable to anyone who develops offensive capabilities. It's an arms race, basically. Leia's expression grew grim. Not ideal, but probably inevitable given the competitive nature of international relations. So, humans are trapped in a cycle of developing increasingly dangerous technologies to defend against other humans developing increasingly dangerous technologies, summarized Professor Zix Thor. That's actually a pretty accurate summary. Yeah, Leia looked impressed. Although it's not just about defense. A lot of research is truly aimed at solving problems and improving life. It's just that the same capabilities that let you solve problems can also be used to create problems. And you don't see a way out of this cycle? Asked Vashti. Well, international cooperation helps. Arms control treaties, research sharing agreements, safety standards, monitoring systems. Leia paused. But cooperation is hard to maintain when there are strong incentives to cheat. And it only takes one bad actor to cause problems for everyone. So, you prepare for the possibility that cooperation will fail, said Nixola. Pretty much. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. It's not a perfect system, but it's better than being unprepared when things go wrong. Leia smiled. Plus, the same capabilities that create risks can also help manage risks. Better technology means better monitoring, better modeling, better response capabilities. You use technology to control technology, observe Morith. Among other things. Yeah, though that creates its own risks. What happens when the control systems fail, or when they're subverted, or when they develop capabilities you didn't intend? Leia snapped. It's complex systems all the way down. Miss Brennan, Professor Zix said slowly, how do humans cope with this level of uncertainty and risk? Well, most people don't think about it most of the time. Psychological adaptation, I guess. You can't function if you're constantly worried about low probability, high impact events. Leia's tone was matter of fact. Plus, humans are generally quite optimistic. We tend to assume that problems will be solved by someone, somehow, even if we're not sure how. Optimism, repeated Igora, in the face of existential risks? Yeah, it's probably not entirely rational, but it's psychologically necessary. Despair is paralyzing, and you can't solve problems if you're paralyzed. Leia smiled. Plus, humans have a pretty good track record of surviving things that seem unsurvivable at the time. Such as, asked JRA. Well, ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plague epidemics, world wars, economic collapses. Every generation faces challenges that seem overwhelming, and most of the time, we figure out ways to deal with them. Leia's expression grew thoughtful, though I'll admit the stakes keep getting higher as our capabilities expand. You derive confidence from past survival, said Vorak. Past survival and current capabilities. We've got better tools for understanding and managing risks than any previous generation of humans. Leia paused. Although we've also got better tools for creating risks. So, it's not clear whether we're better off overall. But you remain optimistic, observing Professor Zix. Cautiously optimistic. Yeah, I mean, what's the alternative? Pessimism doesn't solve problems, and nihilism doesn't prevent disasters. Leia snapped. Might as well assume we'll figure it out and work toward making that assumption true. The classroom had settled into what could almost be described as contemplative quiet, which was a significant improvement over the previous varieties of disenchanted silence. Miss Brennan, Professor Zix said finally, I think you've given us a great deal to think about. Good. Though, I should probably mention that I'm just one human with one perspective. Other humans might have very different views on these topics. Leia grinned. We're not exactly known for our consensus-building abilities. Different views, the professor repeated, on existential risks and technological development. Oh, absolutely. Some humans think we should slow down technological development to reduce risks. Others think we should accelerate it to solve problems faster. Some think international cooperation is the answer. Others think national self-reliance is more important. Leia paused. And those are just the mainstream positions. There are probably as many different opinions as there are humans. How do you make collective decisions with such diverse perspectives? Asked Keithmore. Badly. Mostly, Leia admitted with a laugh. Democracy, markets, capitalism, litigation, compromise, log rolling, coalition building, interest group politics. We've got lots of mechanisms for aggregating preferences and making collective choices, but they're all imperfect, and they often produce results that nobody's entirely happy with. But they produce results, observed Vashi. Eventually, yeah, though sometimes eventually takes longer than you'd like, and sometimes the results are suboptimal. Leia's expression grew wry. But it's better than having no mechanisms for collective decision-making at all. You prefer imperfect systems to no systems, said Nala. Generally, yeah. Perfect systems don't exist, and waiting for perfection is usually a recipe for paralysis. Leia snapped. Better to have systems that work most of the time and can be improved over time than to have no systems at all. Continuous improvement, mused Professor Zixth. Yeah, that's probably one of our most important survival strategies. We're not perfect, but we're adaptable. We learn from mistakes. We modify approaches that aren't working. We try new things when old things stop being effective. Leia smiled. Although, I'll admit the learning process can be quite painful sometimes. Painful how? Asked Morith. Well, learning from mistakes means making mistakes first. And some mistakes are expensive. Leia's expression grew more serious. Wars, economic crashes, environmental disasters, technological accidents. Every generation pays the price for the previous generation's mistakes and makes new mistakes for the next generation to learn from. But you consider this acceptable, said Yithgara. Acceptable might be too strong a word. Inevitable is probably more accurate. Leia paused. I mean, we try to minimize the mistakes and learn from other people's mistakes when possible. But perfect foresight isn't really achievable. You make decisions with incomplete information and deal with the consequences as they arise. Adaptive management, Professor Zix said, jotting down observations. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You can't plan for every contingency, so you build systems that can respond to unexpected events and modify strategies based on new information. Leia nodded approvingly, though it helps to have some core principles that don't change even when tactics and strategies evolve. Such as, asked Jexra, well, human dignity, individual rights, democratic governance, rule of law, scientific inquiry, technological development, international cooperation. Leia paused. Though even those principles get interpreted differently by different people, and the relative priority can shift depending on circumstances. Flexible principles, observed Vorthak, more like stable principles with flexible implementation. The goals don't change much, but the methods for achieving them evolve as conditions change. Leia considered. Although I'll admit, there's always tension between maintaining core values and adapting to new realities. And when those concerns can't be resolved through normal political processes, asked Professor Thar. Leia was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Well, that's when you get social unrest, political instability, sometimes armed conflict. Not ideal, but it's usually better than letting unresolvable tensions build up until they explode. You prefer controlled conflict to uncontrolled conflict, said Kethmore. Generally, yeah. Better to have managed disputes than unmanageable crises. Leia snapped. Although the trick is keeping the controlled conflict from escalating into uncontrolled ones. And if they do escalate, asked Vashi, then you deal with the escalation using whatever tools are available. Negotiation, mediation, economic pressure, political intervention, international involvement. Leia paused. And if none of those work, then you're back to the military options we began discussing. Full circle, Professor Zixth observed. Yeah, everything's connected. Politics, economics, technology, military affairs, social issues. You can't really understand any one area without understanding how it relates to all the others. Leia smiled, which is probably why this conversation has wandered so far from the original topic. The original topic being human warfare, said Nikala. Right. But you can't understand human warfare without understanding human society. And you can't understand human society without understanding human nature. And you can't understand human nature without understanding human evolution and history and culture. Leia gestured broadly. It's all part of the same system. Systems thinking, murmured Professor Zix Thor, still writing furiously. Yeah, everything affects everything else, often in non-obvious ways. Change one thing, and you change everything, though sometimes the changes take a while to become obvious. Leia's expression grew thoughtful, which is probably why predicting the future is so difficult. Too many variables, too many feedback loops, too many unintended consequences. But you try to predict the future anyway, observed Morith. Well, you have to make plans based on some assumptions about what's going to happen. Better to make explicit predictions that can be tested and revised than to make implicit assumptions that never get examined, Leia smirked. Plus, the act of trying to predict the future often helps you prepare for many possible futures. Scenario planning, said Yithkara. Exactly. You can't know what's going to happen, but you can think through what you'd do if various things happened. Then when something actually does happen, you're not starting from zero. Leia smiled. Although reality usually turns out to be weirder than any of your scenarios, such as ending up in an alien classroom discussing human military theory, suggested Professor Zixth with what might have been humor. Yeah, that definitely wasn't in any of my scenario plans, Leia admitted with a laugh. Although I'm glad it happened. This has been one of the most interesting conversations I've had since I got here. For us as well, said Keithmore. Although I suspect we'll need considerable time to process all of this information. Yeah, it's a lot to think about, though. If you want my advice, don't try to process it all at once. Human approaches to these issues developed over thousands of years of trial and error. It would be unrealistic to expect to understand everything immediately. Leia paused. Plus, understanding is different from agreeing. You might understand why humans do things the way we do without thinking it's the right way for your species. Different solutions for different circumstances. Professor Zixth observed. Exactly. What works for humans might not work for species with different psychology, different history, different environmental pressures, different economic capabilities. Leia smiled. Although there might be some general principles that apply across species. Problem-solving, adaptation, cooperation, conflict resolution. Those seem pretty universal. Universal principles with species-specific implementations, said Vashti. That's probably a good way to think about it. Yeah. Leia nodded around the room. Although I'd be curious to learn more about how other species handle these issues. Comparative analysis might reveal patterns that aren't obvious when you only look at one case. Perhaps that could be the focus of our revised curriculum, suggested Professor Zixth. Comparative approaches to conflict resolution and social organization. That sounds like it would be really interesting, Leia agreed. And probably more useful than just focusing on human warfare in isolation. The soft chime that indicates the end of the class period chose that moment to sound, causing everyone to look around in surprise. Somehow 2 hours had passed without anyone noticing. Well, said Professor Thera, looking at her extensive notes. I think we've covered considerably more ground than I had planned for today's session. Yeah, sorry about that, Leia said, though she didn't sound particularly sorry. I tend to ramble when I get started on topics I find interesting. Don't apologize, said Keith Moore as he gathered his materials. This has been far more educational than our usual lectures. Although considerably more unsettling, added Vashti, though her tone was more thoughtful than distressed. Knowledge often is unsettling, Leia observed. That's usually a sign that you're learning something important. As the students began filing out of the classroom, several of them stopped to thank Leia for sharing her perspectives. Professor Zixth remained behind, still documenting everything frantically. Miss Brennan, she said finally, Would you be interested in serving as a guest lecturer for this course on a more regular basis? Sure, that sounds like fun. Although you might want to bring in some other perspectives, too. I'm just one data point, Leia grinned. Plus, some of the other veterans in the exchange program have different specialties. Infantry, intelligence, logistics, medical. Might be interesting to get their takes on some of these issues. That's an excellent suggestion. I'll reach out to the program coordinators. Professor Zix paused at her note-taking. Though I have to ask, do all human educational experiences involve this level of intellectual disruption? Leia laughed. Only the good ones.